In our last lecture, we examined Hegel's philosophy of history and saw that Hegel used history to argue against the mechanistic materialism of the Enlightenment in favor of a more idealist and historicist perspective. In this lecture, we turn to a both disciple and critic of Hegel, Karl Marx. In many ways, Marx was the last partisan of the Enlightenment. He was profoundly affected by Hegelian philosophy as well as Kantian moral theory, French political communism, and British political economy. But I think Marx's overarching goal in synthesizing these various sources was to create a world philosophy which would, in fact, answer Hegel's idealist explanation of history in purely naturalistic or scientific terms. So Marx wants ultimately to argue that the Enlightenment was right, that you can come up with a naturalistic and law-like explanation of human development and historical change. Well, there's a challenge involved in this. Marx made his arguments in a variety of different texts in different stages of his life. In this lecture, we look at one particular thread that is found in many of his writings, his historical materialism. And what I'm going to offer to you is a rational reconstruction of that doctrine based on a variety of different writings. And what I'm going to do is first begin with what I'll call a point of departure, which is the sort of background assumptions and basic premises that Marx engages in formulating his historical materialism. Then, and for the bulk of the lecture, we will look at the actual development of the doctrine of historical materialism, how it is constructed, and what are the laws of development that Marx thought existed in the past and could be verified scientifically. And then finally, look at what the implications for that philosophy of history and theory of historical materialism are for current historical realities. So let's begin first with that background set of issues. Our point of embarkation is a phrase Marx throws away in the Communist Manifesto, where he says, communism is the solution to the problem of history. Well, what does Marx mean by the problem of history? What is, after all, the problem of history? And it turns out it's what Marxists call a problematic, or a set of background assumptions or issues. In fact, we'll be looking at three critical issues, which constitute the sort of themes that will be developed in our account of historical materialism. And we should expect these themes or issues to interact in a dialectical or dynamic process of evolution in the human past, one that's punctuated by sharp conjunctures, which we refer to as revolutions. All right, the first of these three issues is one that I would describe as philosophical anthropology. And that is, how do we characterize the human species naturalistically? What distinguishes it from the rest of the animal kingdom? Now, traditionally, philosophers have answered that by saying man is a rational animal, right? Man is the reasoning animal. But Marx is a contemporary of Darwin's and a huge disciple of Darwin's, a huge fan of Darwin's. So for him, that puts the evolutionary cart before the horse. Why would humans have developed rationality? What purpose could it have served? And the answer to that, he finds, is man is the only animal that actually refashions his environment in accord with changing needs. So we might define man as homo faber, man the maker, man the tool user. Other animals certainly work and produce. Bees build hives, beavers build dams, but they don't build, or rather, the dams and hives they build are always along the same pattern. It's an instinctual activity. In the case of humans, it's reflective. And this, for Marx, is probably the key to understanding how reason and intellect probably evolved in the first place. It served a distinct evolutionary need. It allowed us to refashion our natural environments in much more productive ways than that of other less intelligent species. Okay, so that's our first background assumption, that man is a producing animal. Man is homo faber. The second is more natural historical, and that's based on an observation, one that has been substantiated by almost all anthropologists since, which is that if we look at every human community, even the most primitive, so-called traditional or hunter-gatherer societies, we find that that task of production is always based on a division of labor. Obviously, this is highly developed in advanced capitalist societies, but in medieval society, the estates or orders was based on a division of labor. Peasants worked, warriors fought, priests prayed. Even primitive hunter-gatherer societies have men hunt, women and children gather. It's a very strict division of labor. And obviously this is because it makes production more efficient. So those are our first two issues. Man homo faber, and man engages in division of labor. The third, which conjoins with these to explain the problem of history, is the issue of scarcity. And it is an historical observation that every society that has ever existed has never been, none of them have been able to produce enough goods to supply all human needs and wants of all members. Right? So it's the very opposite of the problem of surplus. We have never been able to produce enough of all of the goods people want in any given society. And that's the problem of scarcity. Well, that's critical for Marx, because he believes, given that shortage, the fact that there's not enough goodies for everyone, he finds it predictable that one part of society will establish itself as a ruling stratum or class, in order that it might enclose a disproportionate share of those goodies, the social income. And thus they, that one group, will be able to live a more fulfilling and richly rewarding life. Again, this ties into those background assumptions, because production is incapable of supplying all human needs, and the division of classes or stratums will be based on the position one has within the division of labor. This behavior for Marx is strictly causally determined. This is critical because as a political project, Marxists need to denounce, quote, bourgeois exploitation. But as a doctrine of historical materialism, Marx would argue, a la Kant, this is purely heteronymous behavior which cannot be avoided. It is entirely understandable, rational, and predictable that given a shortage of the goods of life, some people will try to get more so that they can live a better life. And that's not morally good or morally bad. It's simply the animal acting on the basis of its self-interest and rationality. Okay, so that's the sort of set of background assumptions and issues that form the context of Marx's development of historical materialism. I want now to engage in a rational reconstruction of that second task I laid out. Marx's historical materialism begins by positing two fundamental entities. From these two entities, we will derive all other historical phenomena. They are, on the one hand, historical persons, actual historical flesh and blood, and on the other, something he calls the forces of production. Well, actual historical persons are fairly straightforward. The kicker, obviously, is going to be that other element, the forces of production. And we'll find that the story of human history is, in fact, largely the story of the development of the forces of production, or productive forces. All right, so what do we mean by productive forces? They, in turn, will be comprised of two elements. One is called the means of production, and the other he calls abstract labor power. What are the means of production? Well, they are simply those things we use to produce. So, obviously, tools. If one is a blacksmith, one's anvil and hammer and forge are the means of production. If one is a farmer, one's plow and seed are means of production. So we have tools. We also have to include facilities or productive spaces. If one runs a factory, you may not own that factory. You may lease it. And even if you own it, that space is critical to your production. So it includes tools as well as productive spaces. Again, this is particularly important in earlier periods of technology when, for example, you used water to power a mill. A particular site near a stream or river was therefore critical as a means of production. Okay? And finally, raw materials, which are the objects of labor. And I don't want to insist on this notion of raw material in any hard and fast way. We should describe those as simply whatever enters a productive process and is refashioned. So a blacksmith working on iron bars and fashioning them into horseshoes is treating those iron bars as if they were raw materials. In fact, they're not. They're rolled from iron ore that is extracted from the ground. But in any given productive process, the inputs we'll call raw materials and the outputs we'll call the final results of the productive process. So those are the means of production. Far more important is the second element in those forces of production, abstract labor power. And that too will be made of, not surprisingly, two elements. We seem to be caught up on the number two. One is the mechanical power of the human musculature. Right? Abstract labor power must include that, the physical ability of us to burn calories and get work done. And of course, that is a historical phenomenon because it does vary with time and place. The amount of protein you have in your diet has a lot to do with the amount of labor you can undergo, how much physical musculature you can exert. The amount of protein you had as a child will have a lot to do with, again, your stature, and therefore the amount of force you can deploy through your musculature. So that's certainly one part of it, this mechanical power of the body. But probably the more important part of abstract labor power is technique and skill. And again, this is historical. Techniques and skills evolve over time. As we develop better techniques of rolling iron, our human musculature is able to produce more. As we develop better techniques of plowing, we're able to actually get larger yields from the same inputs of labor and the same amount of acreage. So skill and technique, what we might call technology then, makes up a critical component of abstract labor power. And probably the most important part of skill in the modern epoch is science, right? Because it is applied science which generates technology. So our scientific knowledge of nature and the technology we draw from it is one of the most critical elements of this abstract labor power, and hence Marx's view that this, in fact, does evolve over time. As science and technology evolves, so our mastery over nature, so our ability to produce more and more with constant labor inputs. Okay. So, we have, so far, persons and productive forces, those two elements. They stand in various relations to one another. These Marx calls productive relations or relations of production. For example, I am a factory owner. I stand as a person in a particular relation to that means of production, the factory. I own it. That is a relation of production, ownership. Take another one, that of master and slave. Right? A master owns the abstract labor power of his slave in the person of that slave. So mastery, therefore, would be a second relation of production. Suppose I don't own that factory. Suppose I rent it. That would be another relation of production, renting. For much of the early modern period, particularly in England, for example, much agricultural production would happen on land that was leased. So leasing would be another relation of production. Finally, in modern industrial and post-industrial societies, contracts form one of the basic relations of production, particularly wage labor contracts. I buy your abstract labor power, but not in the form of your person, in the form of a lease on your time, 8 hours a day. Or in a previous period, it might have been by piecemeal. So these are all various different productive relations or relations of production. Marx argues that each of these relations of production will be strongly determined by the stage of historical development of the forces of production. So the simplest way of thinking of it is, as technology changes, so do the relations of production. For example, if we have very primitive agricultural technique, and the only major input in terms of productive force into the soil and producing agricultural goods will be the power of the human musculature, Marx thinks that tends to generate a relationship, a productive relationship of mastery and mastery in slavery. That the most efficient way of maximizing returns, therefore, is to enclose the labor of a person in their person, to own that person. In an advanced capitalist society, on the other hand, where one has to keep one's inventories matched to demand, it's no longer economically necessary or even profitable to own your laborers. It's better to lease their labor time when it's needed. And when it's not, during the downturn of a business cycle, you can simply lay them off. That's a more efficient and productive way. And that is a result of the development of productive forces. Now, if we take the sum total of these productive forces within a particular society, Marx says they constitute what he calls the economic structure of that society. Marx calls this structure the base or basis of the rest of the social structure. Okay. The rest of the social structure, that part of society which is not its economic basis, that web of economic relations or relations of production, Marx calls the superstructure, which is conceived in some sense at least to be epiphenomenal or determined by the economic base. Well, what do we mean by superstructure? We mean institutions like the state, the church. We mean various cultural mores, habits, and customs. And we also mean the various cultural representations found in a society like art, literature, philosophy, etc. And Marx's deep point is that ultimately, at some level, each of these institutions and practices, whether it be states or works of art, etc., serve to regulate and legitimate the existing relations of production of the economic structure. Now, this seems a very counterintuitive notion, but there are in fact good examples to sort of explain what Marx is trying to get at. Take, for example, a cultural phenomenon like sports. Marx would argue that the kind of sport you find in a given society will have a lot to do with its economic base or basis. In a medieval peasant society where there's very little division of labor and where the basis of communality and production is the village itself, we should expect to find sports which celebrate village life and that mode of production. And the perfect example of that are the primitive forms of the game we call soccer and they call football in Europe, where again, there is very little division of labor, everyone kicks the ball, everyone passes the ball, and in which we work as more or less a sort of organic unit or an organic whole. We could think of a capitalist agricultural society producing a game which would have probably a little more division of labor and a little more individualism, like, say, agrarian America producing the game of baseball, where again everyone catches and everyone fields and bats, but nonetheless one person is a specialist at pitching, another at catching, etc. Finally, in an advanced industrial society, we would expect to find sports that celebrate just that sort of factory production. A game like American football, where there is an intense division of labor. There are large people who never touch the ball, smaller people who never block, and then another guy who may not even speak English and just kicks the ball through the uprights. So you have a very heavy division of labor. Moreover, it also celebrates the rest of our productive process. Note, each of these various units of players are supervised by a sort of shop steward, known as his position coach, all of whom are supervised by a head coach, who is like a factory manager, who is under the control of a general manager, who was like a CEO, who is in fact under the control of the owner of the means of production, the owner of the team. And Marx doesn't think this is the result of some sort of conspiracy. That's what culture does. It celebrates and reflects the life we live, particularly the economic basis of our life. To give you one last example in sport, we play the game lacrosse. It was originally an Indian game. We play with one goal, to win. Right? It's about competition. Because our economy is based on competition, where the winner takes all and the devil takes the hindmost. But the game was originally an Amerindian game. And when they played, they knew precisely who was going to win. Their project was rather different. Their games represented a struggle of the dead spirits against the living. And the only way to appease the dead was to make sure that once a year they got to win in lacrosse. So you knew who was going to win the game. The point came in the elan, the way you pulled it off, the way you acted out your role. Okay. Well, now these various relations of production within a given society, for Marx at least, correspond to a particular development of the forces of production, and especially of that technical and applied science technology. The sum totals of these relations constitute an economic structure that Marx calls a mode of production. And this is a very strange locution. The best way of thinking about it is he's going to argue there are certain fundamental forms of production, stages of production that societies go through. For Marx, there have in fact been three in the civilized West. The first was the slave mode of production of the ancient or classical world. That was succeeded by the feudal or peasant mode of production of the medieval period. And finally, the capitalist mode of production of the modern bourgeois epoch. Okay. So now you've got the nomenclature. Now you've got the sort of large-scale structure of historical materialism. Given that, Marx is now going to offer those laws that he had promised, the laws of historical evolution. And we'll see these are in fact laws of the development of the modes of production based on his own historical researches, some of which were good, some of which were a bit more sketchy. But one of these laws would read something like the following. Every mode of production persists as long as it is capable of fostering the further development of the forces of production. So, as long as a slave mode of production will allow for further development in in plowing techniques or in perhaps harvesting techniques, slavery will continue to persist. It's only when it no longer allows for technical development that it becomes historically outdated. Okay. By contrast, our second law would be when the relations of production or mode of production comes to fetter or retard the development of the mode of production or the forces of production, a period of social transformation ensues in the form of sharp conjunctures which we call revolutions. So when, in fact, a way of organizing society and production comes to actually stand in the way of technological development and productive development, it's precisely at those moments that those existing relations are overthrown on behalf of new relations. For example, to move into the medieval period, when it is the case that the feudal peasant-oriented mode of production will actually retard the development of scientific agriculture, that's precisely that moment at which those forms of production will be overthrown. In England, it will take the form of mass enclosure and scientific farming, which will dispossess the peasants from the land so that greater productivity can be achieved. Again, in industrial societies, relations of personal dependence actually thwart the development of factory-style production. Slaves have no motive to be particularly efficient and careful with labor-saving devices. For precisely that reason, slavery must be abolished and changed with wage labor in which people will have an economic incentive to be as productive and careful in their labors as possible. All right, I want to offer a third law, which is that every new mode of production gestates within its previous society prior to its replacement of the old mode of production. Which is to say, we do not find only one mode of production at an historical moment. We find that an old society has within it the germ of the new mode of production. So, where would we find feudalism before the rise of feudalism? At the borders of the Roman Empire, in the marchlands of the Germanic peoples. And we might think of, in fact, feudalism as a synthesis between the warrior culture of the Germanic peoples on the one hand and the patriarchal slavery and patrimonial domination of Roman villa life on the other. The synthesis of the two produces something like the feudal ties of vassalage and dependence. So then feudalism gestated in the marchlands of the European Roman Empire, and when that empire finally collapsed, it emerged as the new basis for a new society. Similarly, the capitalist mode of production gestated in, as it were, the womb of the feudal society. Beginning sometime in the 12th or 13th century, we find the emergence of trading cities, the Hanse cities in Germany, the cities of the Champagne fairs in France, and of course Antwerp and later Amsterdam in the north, Genoa, Venice, and Siena in the south of Europe. All of these were in fact bourgeois communities, communities of burghers, that had existed sort of within the larger structure of feudal domination. When that old feudal structure finally became a relic, it was overthrown, and what emerged from within it was the already gestated capitalist mode of production. And of course, this has important implications for socialism, which Marx would argue gestates within the capitalist mode of production in labor unions, where workers associate on the basis of production and on the basis of communality. So it's there that we find the first seeds of the next organization of the forces of production. This has profound implications, however, for capitalism, because it is the capitalist mode of production that is the first truly dynamic economic structure. Previous economic structures had expanded by simply taking in more territory or persons. But in capitalism, each laborer becomes more productive through the development of more technology. Marx calls this revolutionizing the means of production. And he says it's not coincidental that it happens in capitalism. Competition demands that each businessman invest in the latest technologies. Moreover, that he invest in the research and development of future technologies for labor-saving devices so that he can get a leg up in the competitive struggle with his colleagues and enemies. This means that the bourgeois or capitalist mode of production must by nature revolutionize the means of production and superdevelop the productive forces. And this brings us to that final point I wanted to raise. What are the implications of historical materialism for our current situation, according to Marx? For Marx, the bourgeois mode of production expands productive forces, science and technology, to the point where it is finally possible to solve the problem of scarcity, the problem that had presented us with history, as it were, in the beginning. And that is because it is constantly reinvesting in research and development. The problem, however, is that given the disproportionate distribution of incomes under capitalism, the fact that the vast majority of income goes to a small number of people and the vast majority of workers get a very small share of that income, the vast bulk of the population lacks the financial resources to consume the plenitude of means and commodities that industrial capitalism can produce. And the result is periodic crises of underconsumption, when factories produce quite efficiently, and yet the majority of people lack the resources to purchase those commodities as they are produced. We call those recessions. When they're not too heavy, when they're very bad, we call them depressions. And Marx says they are the very essence of the unfolding of competition within the bourgeois mode of production. And thus, what have we found? The relations of production, property relations, are coming to fetter the development of productive forces. And think about what happens when a factory closes during a recession or a depression. It's not that it's not producing as efficiently as ever. It's not that it's not using energy and labor as well as it had before. It's simply that there are not enough people with enough money to buy the things the factory is producing. And therefore, he would argue, it's the relations of production, the distribution of incomes, that is fettering the development of productive forces. And when that happens, we know what the result will be. A transformation of the mode of production, probably taking the form of a political revolution. That next transformation is, of course, communism, which Marx sees as the solution to the problem of history. By redressing the problem of disparate incomes, the last fetter to the problem of the productive forces is removed, and the problem of scarcity is solved on a global basis. For Marx, this is more than just a turn in history. This is a fundamental transformation, because up to this point, our action has been determined in a law-like fashion by scarcity. But once scarcity is gone, there's nothing anymore to determine our actions, which means that it's through transformation of the modes of production that we actually achieve the Kantian goal of a kingdom of ends. After the revolution, after the institution of communism, as it were, we're facing a totally different universe in which we are truly free to follow our will where our reason will leave it. In that sense, everything up to communism is the age of heteronomy. It is, for Marx, as he calls it, the age of prehistory. Real history only begins once technology has solved the problem of scarcity. What follows from that is history proper, where social and cultural development become the unfolding of the free and unfettered human consciousness.